It's the bringing people together and how you work together that matters more than who you work with. And I thought that was fascinating. You can control the behaviors.
Yeah, it is fascinating is the right word. And isn't it interesting how on the face of it, they feel like quite simple answers, and yet they're not easy. And leaders the world over struggle with these things. And that's probably why these studies keep coming out showing, yeah, this is what you need to do.
It's definitely, simple but not easy is what I often say. I mean, I've started studying, reading a couple books about Buddhism recently, and we're going back 1,500 years. It's like, yep, that's still got to work on that. Yep, that's still hard. And, if leaders were Buddhists and actually followed these things, we'd be in much better shape. But it's hard. It really takes self-awareness.
Have you ever heard the saying, I can't see the forest for the trees? Many leaders feel like that every day, that there's just too many trees and they can't see that full picture. Welcome back to the Leading with Integrity podcast, your compass for navigating the ever-evolving landscape of leadership. Today's episode is a captivating journey into the heart of successful technology leadership. Here's a question for you then. Have you ever wondered how a small daily impact can accumulate into a monumental success for your team, your company, and yourself? Well, joining us today is Eric Nehrlich, an executive and leadership coach who specializes in helping leaders make a significant difference in their workplaces. You've already heard one of these just now, but Eric's insights are like gems. They're polished through years of experience in technology companies, spanning startups to some of the giants of the tech industry. And together today, we're going to unlock the secrets to team unity, collaboration, and how leaders can inspire others to not just succeed, but thrive in the fast-paced world of technology and beyond. We'll be exploring the art of leadership that can transform those small daily actions into game-changing results, proving that leadership in tech or elsewhere is indeed simple, but not easy. This is Leading with Integrity Leadership Talk, the podcast for first-time managers who are working in tech-driven businesses and teams and who want to be more effective, people-first leaders. Each week, you will learn the crucial strategies, mindsets, and practical tips that successful modern leaders follow to be engaging, ethical, and authentic managers who get the best from their teams. And we'll achieve all of this via weekly conversations with leaders, with leadership experts, entrepreneurs, and business owners, people who have already walked this path and have some amazing insights to share, with an added sprinkling of occasional solo episodes and some group chats where we'll have multiple guests. My name is David Hatch, and I will be your host. And leadership has always been a passion for me. After a career spent in a series of small businesses during 15 years in the aerospace industry, 5 or 6 of those at the end of that career were in a space startup in the UK. So trying to launch satellites into orbit, very cool stuff. And through all of that experience, I learned that the secret to successful management is in the ability to apply great leadership. And in turn, the secret to great leadership, it's all about your integrity, putting people before profits.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Eric, thank you for joining me today. A bit of an early start for you today, but maybe not as bad as it could have been with our original schedule. So I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. I really appreciate it. And yeah, the original time offered on your calendar was 6 a.m. California time. I'm like, oh, I can do it. But 9 a.m. is much more humane for me.
Yes, humane, like it. Yeah. Sorry about that. It's the downside of being in the UK and the time difference.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so we're here. We've made it. That's the main thing.
Yes. I think it's amazing that we can even have this conversation. I mean, it's like, oh, you're in the UK, I'm in California. It's like, oh, no big deal. We can just hop on a podcast together. It's pretty awesome.
It is, definitely. I agree. I guess the weird thing about it is that's been the case for probably a decade or more, isn't it? But it's only really become normal, in inverted commas, since COVID. Very strange to me that we didn't just always do it that way. But
I think it would happen inside companies. I mean, certainly when I was at Google,
Yeah.
I had a lot of early meetings when I had to meet with Europe using Google
Yeah,
Meet,
sure.
actually. So I was familiar with this 10 years ago. But yeah, using it more generally has definitely come a long way in the last few years.
yeah. Yeah, maybe it says more about the industries I've worked in, where it was better to just get on a plane and go and shake someone's hand, and all of that entails with the travel and the angst and the carbon footprint and all the rest of it. But anyway,
Yeah.
So to kick us off, then I'm going to take a calculated risk, which I'm sure isn't really a risk, and let you have the virtual control, as it were, and introduce yourself. Tell the listeners a bit about your background, which you've already hinted at, what you do today, and why you do it.
Yeah. So as of now, I employ myself as an executive coach, helping leaders grow their impact. The way I got here is kind of encapsulates a lot of my career, but the short version is I started off as a physics student, dropped out of grad school to become a software engineer, worked at a bunch of startups here in Silicon Valley. And what I call my origin story as an executive coach happened in my second job, where I joined a startup that had an amazing tech team. Like some of the best people I've ever worked with, just fantastic engineers and PhDs and physicists. And we built something that nobody else in the world could do at the time. And the company raised $40 million off of our work, and things were going great. And we went bankrupt a year later. I'm like, I don't understand what happened here. Like, we are delivering on everything we're supposed to do, and somehow the company went bankrupt because our CEO was an idiot, basically. And I was like, okay, doesn't matter how good I am in engineering if all my work can go to waste because of bad business, bad strategy, bad leadership. So that's when I started pivoting my career to go like, I got to learn about this. I really don't understand it. I got to learn about it. So I went back and got a degree in technology management to kind of pivot my career. And then I joined Google on the business side. So I started doing business modeling, business strategy. And that was actually inspired by one of my professors at my degree program, where he said, if you want to understand how executives think, you have to understand the money. And as an engineer, I did not understand the money. But I figured if I was forecasting revenue, I would really understand the money. And that turned out to be true. And it turned out that executives really cared what revenue was doing. So soon after I joined Google, I was in meetings with Larry and Sergey and Eric Schmidt, the leaders at Google, trying to explain what revenue was going to do. This was 2009 during the Great Recession. So they were very curious, like, hey, what's revenue going to do? I'm like, how the heck should I know? Nobody in the world knows what's going to happen. And somehow this new analyst in the company is being asked these questions. But it definitely thrust me into thinking things at a very big picture level. And I parlayed that into later becoming the chief of staff for the search ads team at Google. So leading business strategy and operations for that team, which was, at the time, $100 billion business. It's bigger now. It's kind of fun to say that I was like, part of the leadership team of a $100 billion business, obviously all due to my doing. Nobody else had anything to do with it. But I did that for 6 years. I think I was chief of staff, and then was starting to look for what's next. And that was like mega scale, like huge business, lots of people. And I really wanted to get back to micro scale, one-on-one, talking to people. Because I was missing that kind of connection. I was like, instead of being like a little cog in a huge machine, I wanted to have a really straight up personal impact. And I went back to this origin story where I watched bad leaders waste the efforts of all people at the company. I'm like, leadership is something I'm really interested in. And so that's what I do now. I switched my career to become an executive coach. I left Google about 4 years ago, and I work with leaders now, both at startups and at big tech companies, to help them figure out how to become better leaders.
I must say, there's a lot of familiar elements to that story. If I reflect on it too much, it gets a bit depressing, like how common it is that people have this experience with bad leaders. We've all heard that, haven't we? My CEO is an idiot. Yeah, I think everyone can say that, can't they? From some point of their career without naming names. But what I find particularly interesting about your journey is that you've gone from, I guess, the opposite in a way to, well, not even really the opposite to me, but a very different path to me. And yet had very similar experiences. And so I think you've hit the nail on the head about the small business as well. I've spent my whole career in small businesses for exactly that reason. Like, you actually feel like you're making an impact and you're not that cog lost in the machine of a big corporation. But yeah, why are there so many bad leaders? I know the answer to that, and yet it still frustrates me.
I know that's a rhetorical question, but I'm going to jump in and say, like, no leader intends to be bad.
No, exactly. Yeah, I know.
They're doing the best they can. They just don't have the tools. They don't have the self-awareness. And we don't teach people how to be good leaders. And I think that's a lot of it. It's like we just don't give people the feedback and the training they need. So, yes. I mean, good for me. It's means it's a business opportunity for me as a coach, but I would prefer it if this was handled in a more scalable way.
Well, yes, likewise. It's one of those things, isn't it, where I don't know, it's not mostly about the money, is it? I mean, certainly not for me. It's because having been through those experiences, and I'm sure it's the same for you.
Yeah, about the money. I mean, I would have been making far more money if I was still at Google. I mean, Google has a lot of money.
Yeah, this is it, isn't it? But I guess the thing with leadership, particularly when we talk about improving people's skills and doing it as an industry almost, if you're not one of these like massive training organizations, it really can't be about the money, I think, because so few companies seem to be interested in spending money on that sort of thing, at least for early career leaders, which I think is where it needs to happen. I'm biased, obviously, because that's where A, you can have the biggest impact, and B, it's the most overlooked. It's where people actually need it the most, because they are the ones, in my opinion, who are doing what I would call like the coalface of leadership. They're the ones who are most likely to be interfacing with the actual employees who are doing the actual work and the actual customers who are paying the actual bills. But I'd love to hear what it's like in Google, because they actually have quite a good reputation on this kind of thing, in the way that they support their leaders and managers. But quite often you see the leadership training budget, let's say, goes on the leadership, and in a big corporation, that means the executives, the people who are at the top end, who are towards middle or end of their careers, rather than the people who I would say actually need it the most, which is the early career leaders who've had no experience of leadership.
Yeah, I mean, Google, I think, does better than most in investing in its people. It offers included coaching for everybody director and above. So if you're a director above, you just get an executive coach, and you just ask for it and you get it, which is pretty generous. And even if below that level, they're now start offering Better Up, I think, for employees below that level. So at least there's something. I have some thoughts on Better Up and other coaching platforms, but I'll leave that for later. But one of the things Google has done and continues to do is offer an educational reimbursement program, which is amazing. And I've learned that you can use it. People can use it to pay for coaching. So I just tell all my Google clients, like, hey, go here. You can get 2/3 paid back if your manager approves this coaching. And here's how you convince them that this coaching is going to benefit you. So they're really generous about this. I actually got Google to pay for 2/3 of my coaching training by using that using that program. So very generous of them.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, a few years back, I don't know if it was an internal study or if it was funded research, but the Google standard for management training was in all the headlines. And from what I've read of it, it seems to be pretty spot on, actually, and annoyingly, given what we both do.
Absolutely. No, that was a really interesting study. Yeah, I think it was that project, either Oxygen or Aristotle. I think Oxygen was the one that was managers. I mean, it said really basic stuff, like you should make your people feel safe. Like psychological safety was the number one thing, dependability, and then like clarity about roles and responsibilities. Like of the top things that made teams effective, those are the top 3. And you'll notice what's not in there is like the actual people. It's like, if you get this PhD superstar, that's not actually what makes the team successful. It's the bringing people together and how you work together that matters more than who you work with. And I thought that was fascinating, because you can control the behaviors.
Fascinating is the right word. And isn't it interesting how on the face of it, they feel like quite simple answers, and yet they're not easy. And leaders the world over struggle with these things. And that's probably why these studies keep coming out, showing yeah, this is what you need to do. And well, yeah, that makes perfect sense, but might sound simple, but it's not easy. It's people get those two words mixed up, I think. But
It's definitely, simple but not easy is what I often say. I mean, I've started studying, reading a couple books about Buddhism recently, and we're going back 1,500 years. It's like, yep, that's still got to work on that. Yep, that's still hard. And if leaders were Buddhists and actually followed these things, we'd be in much better shape. But it's hard. It really takes self-awareness. It really takes effort to move away from kind of our base instincts, our ego-driven, our fight or flight responses, to think in a more elevated way, let's say.
Indeed. Obviously, from that story, you've changed career a few times. And I know you say went and did another degree and went and did this course, and which makes it sound, I suspect, a lot easier than it really was. So how do you actually pivot your career? Because it can't be that easy, right?
It can be. I mean, I had a bunch of advantages working in my direction. So when I dropped out of grad school to become a programmer, it was a friend of mine from MIT offered me a job. He's like, "You're smart. You know how to program computers. I can figure out the rest with you." So that was pivot number one. I used a friend to pivot careers. Pivoting from engineering to the business side of things. But yes, I took a master's degree. That definitely helped. But then the way I actually got the job at Google was, again, through the MIT network. There's something posted on an MIT job board. I didn't know the person myself, but we met up for coffee. He's like, "Yeah, you don't quite fit the job qualifications, but you're really interesting and you have a great perspective. I'll figure out how to make this work." So it was really the human connection in both those cases. And then pivoting to coaching was the first time I kind of did the deliberate pivot, where I was like, okay, this is where I'm trying to go. This is how I'm going to get there. So that one was much more thoughtful. I mapped out the path ahead by talking to a few professional coaches. Like, how do you get started? What do you do? I started coaching people for free and doing volunteering coaching for people to see if I actually liked it and if I wanted to do it. I did take a course. I took a year-long training course. And then even at that point, I was still like, okay, can I actually turn this into a job? So I ran a coaching business on the side for a year, trying to, with a few paying clients, to prove, will people pay me to do this thing I enjoy doing? And at the end of that year, I was like, okay, I like doing it. People are paying me to do it. I can build this from here. And so then that's only when, at that point, did I take the leap and start a new pivot. But I guess the real thing I'll say is, you got to know people. That's the thing. What I often tell people is if you're trying to pivot careers and get hired at a new job, you're going to fail. Because think about it this way. If I'm a hiring manager and I have a choice for two candidates, one that's done the job before and one that doesn't, I'm going to take the one that's done the job before, because why would I add that extra risk? Because I already don't know these people. There's already risk in hiring somebody I don't know. And you're asking me to double the risk by saying you haven't done it before. And so what I often tell people that's true is get hired with your old skill set. Get hired in whatever role you can to get into the company. Once you're in the company, get to know the people in the function you want, the department you want, and then transition. Because then you're only asking them to make one risk. They know you now, they trust you, they believe you're competent, and they'll teach you what you need to know. So, even in the case where I got hired at Google, I met the guy in person. I mean, it was only a 1 hour coffee, but he really, we really hit it off. We really got along. He's like, okay, I'm willing to take this risk because I've met you. I can see how you're going to be helpful to me. So minimize the risk for the hiring manager is kind of the point of if you're trying to pivot, because it's understandable. They don't want to take double risk if they don't have to.
What I really like about that answer is that you've managed to focus on the people aspects of it, which of course are important. But you've also, I don't know if it was intentional or unconscious, but the way you've explained it, it was very engineering process driven. Follow these steps, do these things, these interactions matter, these are the dependencies. I really liked that. And I think that maybe the aspect that you didn't give voice to is it's not just about knowing other people and having the contacts and the referrals. It's about knowing yourself as well and understanding, what you enjoy doing, what you're good at. And then obviously the business hat comes in with the market validation and who's actually going to pay me to do this. Is it nobody? In which case, time to go back to plan A. But yeah, I really like that answer. That was really good.
Ah, thanks. I've had some practice at it, but yeah, that point about like validating the market demand for it. It's like, if it's going to be your career, you can't just enjoy doing it. It's got to be also like something people will pay you to do. Like the number of times I've talked to startup founders who are like, let me show you this cool technology. I'm like, okay, what problem are you solving? They're like, look at the cool technology. I'm like, I don't care. I mean, yes, it's a cool technology, but you don't have a business unless you're solving a problem that people will pay you to solve. And that's true for startups, and the same applies for you getting hired. Like they're paying you to deliver business value in the end. So what's the business value you're going to deliver is a thought that you should be thinking about in your career. Again, it's all about the money. I hate to say it, but this is the capitalist world we live in. And if you can tie your value to the money, you're going to have more success.
Yeah, I see the logic. Again, it's not always that easy, is it? Like it's simple, but anyway. Yeah, I mean, another familiar story there with the number of times you speak to staff. In fact, yeah, me too. In fact, I've learned that mistake the hardest possible way by being in one of those startups where they're building that product because the technology is cool, and then thinking about later or afterwards, if ever, about is there actually a customer for it though? Or are we doing this just because we think it's cool? And it is I mean, to a certain extent, there's nothing wrong with that. That's how we've got a lot of the cool technology we have these days, right? Because
Google started that way. They had no business model to start. I mean, literally, I always tell the story. People are like that. What's the business potential? I'm like, Larry and Sergey tried to sell Google for $1 million to Yahoo, and Yahoo refused to pay. Like, if we knew what the future would hold, that would be like the best decision in history. And instead it was denied because like people can't see the future. So it's like this tension. It's like, if you can figure it along the way. And sometimes that's true. And having some path to business value is really important. And, that's just, life is, I think part of what makes things simple but not easy is life is complex. There's a lot of things you're kind of balance, a lot of different things. And you can optimize for one thing really easily. But if you're trying to optimize across 10 different dimensions, you're likely to do a bad job of optimizing. And that makes it really hard.
Absolutely. I guess the ultimate expression of simple but not easy is just the word balance, isn't it? Because all of these complexities, if you want to actually succeed at what you're doing, you have to be effective at balancing all of those and managing them all at the same time, which, yeah. I mean, as I say, it's the ultimate, isn't it? Ultimate case of it sounds really simple, but it's not easy.
It's not easy at all, because if you're trying to balance 10 things and somebody else is saying like, I'm just going to do one thing, I'm going to focus only on that, they are going to outperform you. Guarantee it, because they're putting all their time and attention and energy in one place, and you're spread across different things. And it's I wish it were different sometimes, but it's just like, it's just a function of your time and attention and energy. And people are like, how do I do all this and be a great dad and a great family? I'm like, there's going to be a trade-off. Like you can find ways to be more productive. You can find ways to kind of squeeze it in. But if in the end you're taking some of your time and attention and putting it elsewhere, the person that's 1000% focused on work is going to outperform you. I mean, it's just the way it is.
Yes, indeed. And leads us perhaps tangentially into the next question. But when you talk about time, energy, effort, concentration, attention, all of these things, and managing and balancing all of that stuff, I know that you've also had some experiences with burning out. So how do you recover from that as well? And what can you learn from that experience?
So, yeah, I joined Google and I had the peculiar experience for the first time in my career that people actually recognized what I was doing. And so my other jobs, I was 10 years into my career at that point. My other jobs, I would start a new job, take about 6 months to figure out, start performing pretty well, get bored after a year, look for the next job. So I was changing jobs every 2 years. At Google, spent 6 months getting up to speed, figuring things out, got things under control. And people are like, oh, you have that under control. Oh, you should take on this too. Oh, you got that too? Oh, here's some more work. Oh, you got that too? Here's some more work. And as soon as I leveled up to figure out how to do what I was doing, they gave me more work to do because I was doing the work well, which was flattering and exciting. Like, oh, I'm being trusted with all this important work. I got to take it on. I can't say no to it. Like, how do I turn away from that career opportunity? So 3 years in, I'm working 100-hour weeks. I'm working 8 a.m. to midnight most days, including weekends, and just dying under the load. And like, I don't see my friends. I don't see my family. I don't do anything outside of work because I'm just literally spending all my time at work. And eventually my body just gave out. I woke up on Christmas of 2011 with 103-degree fever. I was in bed for a week. My body just completely collapsed. And so was kind of my low point for that. And the interesting thing for me was that it was the first time I ever actually questioned, like, what am I doing? Like, I had been told that's what it took to get promoted. And I was desperate to get a promotion to prove that I belonged at Google, prove I deserved all this important responsibility. But lying in bed that week, I was like, is this promotion worth it? Like, I am sacrificing. I'd meant to spend time with my family that week. I couldn't because I was sick. And I was like, I'm giving up my family. I've given up my friends. I've given up everything for this promotion. Is it worth it? And for the first time in my life, I said, no, it's not worth it. And that was a real big change for me because I'd always said, if you give me a bar, I'm going to exceed it. Not just meet it. I'm going to exceed the bar, any bar you give me. And this is the first time I was like, it's not worth it. So I went into work in January and I sat down with the manager. I'm like, yeah, I'm not working that hard anymore. And she was like, well, if you can't handle the work, I'm going to give it to somebody that can. Like, okay, I understand. And if you can't handle the work, you're not getting promoted. You're going to have to pull back your performance rating. It's going to lower it. I'm like, you do what you have to do. And because I decided at that point, like, it just wasn't worth it. Like, I was ready to quit rather than keep going. So let's explore the other option. So that's what happened. She slashed my performance rating from strongly exceeds expectations to barely meeting expectations. She took away half my team and gave it to somebody else. And I expected, and the fear I had like gotten the worst possible outcome. Everything I'd feared had occurred. And instead of feeling terrible, I felt great. I'm like, this is great. I can do my job at 40, 50 hours a week. I get paid the same amount of money. I have time to see friends. I took up snowboarding that spring. I was like, this seems like a much better deal. Like, why was I doing that? And that was like a really breakthrough moment for me. Like, I realized I had a choice. I had a choice of how to spend my time. I could choose not to spend all my time on work. I could choose not to put work first and only wait until I did absolutely everything and exceeded expectations at work before I did anything else with my life. For the first time in my life, I set a boundary and stuck to it. And that was really a pivotal moment for me. And if you don't mind me, I'm going to insert a little plug here. I actually have written a book, You Have a Choice, with a subtitle, Beyond Hard Work to Meaningful Impact. And it starts with that story because that was such a pivotal moment for me. And I go through, in the book, I share a little bit more about my experience and the framework I've used over the past 10 years to kind of redesign my life to be more meaningful and balanced, as you put it. So thank you for letting me plug my book.
No, of course. Yeah. What an interesting story. I think one of the things that's particularly unusual about that story is the time that it was happening. So 2011. So in the fallout from the financial crash, like over a decade before the Great Resignation, before anyone had heard of quiet quitting, and you've come to this realization, which now, I mean, is pretty common, isn't it? It's kind of the way the workforce is expected to think now. But back then, that must have been really interesting reactions you must have had from some of your colleagues.
Yeah, they didn't quite know what to make of me, and they continued not to know what to make of me. A few years later, I was in my chief of staff job. My manager was like, okay, so here's what you have to do to get promoted. You're going to take this, and you're going to take on this, you're going to take on this. I'm like, no. She's like, what do you mean no? I'm like, I'm not trying to get promoted. She's like, and my manager's this hard driving person. It's like, yeah, let's go. And I was like, yeah, no, I'm seeing somebody now. I'm going to kind of hang out, and enjoy my life, and do my job, and that's it. She just couldn't process it. It was kind of hilarious. She was like, but that's how I motivate you. I give you promotion opportunities. I'm like, yeah, that's not motivating me. Good luck.
Yeah, I can just see the deer in the headlights expression now, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I must say, I completely applaud that. If only more people had made that realization sooner. I mean, where could the world be now? What if?
Well, you know what? There's a Chinese proverb: the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the next best time is today. And so, that's part of why I wrote this book over the past year. Is like it still needs to be said. We're still trapped people are still trapped in this mindset of like, got to put work above all else, got to sacrifice everything, got to get stuff done, got to overachieve, got to be productive. And the book is kind of designed to help you question all of these gottes, these musts, these shoulds, and say, what are you actually going to choose versus feeling boxed in by all the cultural constraints that are designed to keep you as productive as possible and sacrificing yourself for the company. Let's just say that's kind of the design of capitalism.
There's a thread to pull out there, I think, isn't there, around, the fact that it was Google as well, and this whole question about productivity and what actually it is. So I think, certainly in that environment you've described and in my own early career, and I think a lot of people, even as recently as 5 years ago, even, let's say, productivity meant how many hours you spent at your desk.
Yes.
The actual practical definition of productivity, it's less about just time spent doing a thing, is it? It's about what has been produced during that time. If you can do the same work in 2 hours that someone else does in 10, you're more productive than they are, and that's good. Now, in your case, it sounds like you probably were that, and so the response was, great, you've done it in 2 hours, here's more to do for the next 8 hours. And every time you reduce the amount of time it takes you to do something, you got lumped with more stuff.
I'd love to tell a story here because I wasn't actually being productive with my time. I was being actually pretty inefficient with my time. And I was fortunate to work with a Google director who was very impactful with his time. And he was the kind of guy that the senior leaders of the company, up to and including the CEO and CFO, trusted with strategic analyses. He would put together presentations that could change the minds of like this top leadership at Google and change the strategic direction of the company. And the thing he did that was really impressive was go home at 6 p.m. And I'm like, so at some point I'm like, how do you do this? I see the impact you have, a lot more impact than I have. I'm working 8 a.m. to midnight. You go home at 6 p.m. What do you do? How do you make that happen? And he said, well, I work on the most important thing first. If I don't get to the second thing, it's okay. Wasn't as important. Simple, but not easy. What I was doing at the time was I'd come in at 8 a.m. I'd spend 2 hours on emails. Anybody coming in my inbox, I was responding to them. From 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., I was going to meetings. Anybody put time on my calendar, I was going to the meeting. 5 p.m., I come back to my desk. I respond to all the emails that came in during the day. And then 6 p.m., and I haven't started on the one thing that I have to get done that day, that's on my plate and only mine to do. And that's why I was working till midnight every day. He didn't do any of that. He didn't respond to emails. He didn't go to meetings unless he called them. And he pissed off a lot of people. People were like, well, why do you never respond to me? And he's like, I got bigger things to do. And so he was willing to put up with people being annoyed, people being frustrated with him, because he knew the impact he wanted to have. And he put his time and his attention and his energy there. And he let other things go. And that was the first time I'd seen that modeled, because I'd always had managers like, the manager I had that was burning me out was just like, anytime somebody said, can you do this? She said, yes. And then she gave it to me. So just everything ended up on my plate. And there was like so much busy work that wasn't very impactful. And this guy was like, no, I'm just going to work on the most important thing. And I'm going to decide what's important and manage my schedule that way. So, to your point, yes, I was not as productive as I could have been because I wasn't actually thinking. I was prioritizing unconsciously, keeping everybody around me happy over impact. And that's one thing I help work with as an executive coach, I work with my clients now. Like, what do you really want to focus on? And what are you willing to give up to get that impact?
Yeah, it is a good story. I like it. I can't help feeling, though, that the confidence he must have had to have there of the security of his position and just, or just not caring whether he lost his job, I suppose. One or the other, maybe both. I think, certainly, certainly in the context of the organization that you've described, and I think a lot of workplaces, the world over, not just back then, but sadly, probably even today, it's not always that easy, is it? Like you make those decisions and it will mean you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your opportunities. And I mean, I think that's why we've seen a rise in the last few years of so many people going out on their own and being self-employed, starting their own companies. That's certainly for me. I mean, that was the only way I got control of my schedule finally and completely, and can now work in exactly the way you've just described, because I own the business. There's no one there to pile the busy work on my shoulders. Apart from myself, which I'm very good at only occasionally doing.
Yeah, I hear that. Yeah, it's a good point that like he had the confidence and the security that he could get away with that. And it is, this brings up a point I should make about privilege. It's like, he was a well-established man and he could say no to people and it wouldn't really damage him. And I've worked with clients who are women, and especially women of color. If they said no in the same way, exact same way, that would be all that would be on the performance review. It's like, you did not deliver on this one thing, therefore you did not meet expectations. And whereas he was lionized for the upside and people let the other stuff go, if you are from under a differently privileged background, then sometimes people say, oh, that shows you can't do your job. And that's all they see. So there's an element of privilege here, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, I mean, we could go off on another hour's tangent talking about what we can do about that, couldn't we?
Yes.
I don't know that there is an answer, to be honest. Certainly not an easy one or a simple one.
No, not simple, not easy. It's one of those things where, I mean, I do try to work. I should devote about some of my coaching time to people from underprivileged and historically excluded populations, because they don't get the sort of mentoring and opportunities that I got. Like, people took chances on me when I didn't meet all the requirements. And I'd like to think it was because I'm so amazing, but it also helps I look like I do. I'm tall, I'm white passing, I'm male. And they're like, this guy's got to figure it out. Whereas somebody else who didn't look like me would not be given the same chances. And so when I work with, like, say, a woman of color, it's challenging because they're facing different challenges than I did. And there's things they can't change. So all we can do is focus on what's in their control. And I often go on a rant that, like, the only thing that's really in your control is your next action. The past has already happened. Can't change it, no matter how much you complain. The future is complex. A lot of things can happen. There's no guarantees, no matter how good your plan. You can't control other people because they got their own stuff going on and their own experience and their own interpretations, their own stories. So when you get right down to it, it's like, what am I going to do with my next action is the only thing I can control. And that turns out to be quite powerful if you really take it seriously. So with women of color, it's like, okay, your boss is a jerk and is not treating you well. The choice is, do you want to look for another opportunity? Or do you want to figure out how to work within this unfair system? I don't like those choices either, but those are the choices we're facing. And I'm happy to help you work through either of them and kind of figure out a strategy or a plan of attack. And that turns out to be really helpful, not just for women of color or people from underprivileged backgrounds, but anybody. It's like, just what are you going to do next? Complaining is great. Sometimes you need to vent. And then, what are you going to learn from the experience? What are you going to do differently?
That's the only way to go, isn't it, when there are that few choices? Yeah, and it is definitely powerful in any circumstance, isn't it? I mean, we can all think back to the bad job we've had, or that terrible, difficult manager we've had to work for. And you're right, like, the first instinct is, I'm just going to complain all the time and not work as hard. And, well, that's how we've ended up here, isn't it? Is by making a different choice. So there we go.
Yep, absolutely.
So on the subject of those difficult managers or difficult colleagues, even, let's just say difficult people as a category, if that's a fair category, what advice would you have for handling those people, for being able to work with them and remain productive? I
mean, to reiterate a point I made earlier, I think everybody's doing the best they can. And while they may be difficult for me to work with, it doesn't mean they're difficult for everybody to work with. And I can complain and hope that they change to make it easier for me to work with them. But that's kind of leaves me stuck because there's nothing I can do to affect that outcome. Or I can figure out how to change myself to work with them more effectively. And that starts by understanding, what do they care about? What's important to them? A thing I often tell my clients to do is, even if you're a junior person in an organization, they're like, I don't get FaceTime with the VP. How do I know what they care about? I'm like, here's what you do. In every single meeting with that VP, you write down everything they say, every question they ask, every comment they make. If you write it down, I guarantee you'll look at it and you'll be like, oh, this is what they care about. Because that's where their mind's going to go. They're going to always be asking with an angle that supports what they care about, like this risk or this opportunity. And then when you're presenting to them, you present to them in terms of the thing they care about. Again, simple, but not easy. But sometimes it is. My typical example is working with salespeople. I never used to work well with salespeople because I was a tech guy. Like, here's the cool technology. Here's what it can do. Here's the cool feature. They're like, yeah, but I don't care. And eventually I realized every conversation I had with salespeople was about quotas. I was like, wait a second. Their compensation depends on beating quota. Their promotion depends on beating quota. Basically, their entire identity depends on beating quota. Turns out if you put everything in terms of how they can beat quota, salespeople will listen to you. So that was a really, that's an example of, you might consider them difficult, but once you kind of crack the code of what do they care about, it can be a lot easier. I guess I'll add one more story here, if that's okay. So my previous job before Google, I worked with a difficult, he was difficult for me, CEO founder at a startup. We didn't get along. We butted heads a lot. It got to the point where he basically would refuse any idea if it came from me. Like I would pitch something, he'd be like, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. And then 2 weeks later, he'd be like, hey, I thought of this really cool idea. I'm like, really? So I complained about it for a year and that nothing was changing because there was no incentive for him to change because he was in charge. And eventually I was like, okay, there are things I want to get done here. And he doesn't listen to me if I pitch them. But I know who he does listen to. So I went to his lieutenants. And I would pitch them ideas and they'd be like, oh, that's a good idea. And they would pitch him and he'd be like, that's a great idea. We should do that. And then we'd start to do the stuff I wanted to make happen. And I would work behind the scenes to make the features happen and the products happen that I wanted to happen. And I thought that was enough. One problem with the scenario, he didn't figure out that's what I was doing. And so I got fired because I wasn't producing any value. So small miscalculation on my part. I've learned now I actually have to talk about doing the work, not just do the work. But that firing kind of led to the later burnout at Google because then I was like, at my next job, I'm like, I have to prove I can do everything. So you can see how these experiences compound in really interesting and exponential ways.
Yeah, and maybe a lesson in there about overcompensating for a past mistake. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly a lot of bells ringing there for me as well. It is difficult, isn't it? And I mean, I spent years more than I should have in that very similar situation where there's what you said about them having no incentive to change because they're in charge. And it took me a long time to come to that realization and of just sort of, well, of course I'm banging my head against the wall. Why would they listen to me? They don't have to. They don't agree with me. So I'm wasting my breath. I'm going to go and do something else.
Right. Or you find something they care about and then maybe they do start to listen to you. But depends on, but even in that case, it's like, why am I working to benefit somebody that doesn't care about me? That doesn't seem great.
What's on? Yeah. I was too far gone by that point. I guess the point I'm trying to make is about don't assume that there's no option. I think people get very easily stuck in that rut, whether it's because they're worried about being able to pay the bills, pay the mortgage, get the roof over their head, feed the kids, all of those things, which are, of course, massively important. But at the same time, I mean, particularly in the kind of the context of the Great Resignation, we're not living in the same kind of world where the employers have that much control anymore. And even if we did, if they're treating you that badly, you're unfulfilled, you're not enjoying your job, that's going to have an impact in the rest of your life as well. So it's for the better good for your whole life to do something about that specific part of it. And that's something I certainly wish I'd realized many years sooner than I did. But there we go. Lessons learned, eh?
Lessons learned. Yeah. I mean, I tell people like, look, you're making a choice every time you show up for work. And the choice, it might be a great choice because like you said, like you might need the job to pay the mortgage, put the roof over the head, pay for food. But knowing that, putting in that context, then you can reframe it. It's like, look, I'm doing this for my family, for the roof over my head. And it's not fulfilling and it's not great. And yes, I'm putting up with a lot of crap, but on the scale of things, it's not that bad. Like, especially for most of the people we talk to that are tech people, it's like, we're not like scrabbling in the fields 12 hours a day doing backbreaking labor. Like, it's like, you can say like, you can focus on what you don't have, or you can focus on what you do have. Like, you show up and you have a cushy desk job and you get paid a lot of money to do it. Maybe it's not everything you want, but it's still not bad. It could be much worse.
Yeah, that's it. I think it comes down to priorities at the end of the day, doesn't it? It's how much are you going to put up with in order to realize your first priority, assuming that first priority is paying the bills, which it is for most people, I think. If it's not quite there, or if it has parity with other priorities, like I need to do something I care about, or I need to feel like I'm making an impact, then I guess the answer to that is, yes, you've got to pay the bills. You need a job. You don't necessarily need this specific job if it's not working for you.
Mm-hmm.
Which, of course, I mean, maybe we're speaking from privilege here again, as you say. It is a tough one.
Yeah, but I do feel like people have more options than they give themselves credit for. And they don't, I mean, you and I understand over-constrained problems. And so when we actually make all the constraints visible, you start to look at them and like, well, yeah, there's nothing you can do because you've got so many constraints that you literally have no room to move. But if we can name the constraints and start to say like, okay, well, what if you pushed back on that one and loosened that one? Then there's a lot more room to move. And, like that, I think that's part of it. It's like, oh, I have to have a job. It's like, okay, well, I mean, we can look at the financial situation. What could you cut back? But I'm not a financial coach by any means, but start to play around. Like, do you have more room to move than you think? Or how much of this are rules that are only in your own head? And it turns out, for most people, there's a lot of rules in our head that are not laws of nature, it turns out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What would you say is the biggest leadership lesson that you've learned in your career so far?
I think it kind of plays on some of the themes we've been discussing. It's the leadership lessons. It's not about you or not about me. And, if I want leaders for some, there's like formal leadership where you have the manager title or the leadership title. But I think of leadership as identifying stuff that needs to happen and getting people to do it. So you can do that as a manager because you're like, I'll fire you if you don't do it. But you're more effective if you can actually motivate them and get them to care about it and be excited to do it. But for you to do that, you got to understand, what do they care about? What excites them? What is the difference they want to make? And you got to help communicate that to them and inspire them to do the work. And so whether you're talking influence, whether you're talking communication, whether you're talking anything, it's like, it's not about you. Put it in terms the other person cares about. And you're going to be more effective as a leader at any level, whether you're a junior person straight out of college or a CEO. Put it in terms the other person cares about.
Yes. Yeah, I like that. And of course, as you rightly say, the first step to that is knowing what they care about, which I think, again, it's an all too easily skipped step of that process for a lot of managers. And it's knowing your people, isn't it? I think that's got to be the first thing any good leader does, is make sure they know their people.
Yep. Otherwise, you're like my manager that was like, here's what you do to get promoted. I'm like, I don't care about being promoted. And then it's like, they're like, what do I do now? They made an assumption about what I cared about that was not true. And that led to a disconnect.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a similar experience for me, although it was less about promotion and more about the money side of it. And so there was just the assumption, without ever having a conversation, that money was going to be my primary motivator. And for a long time, that was true. There came a point where it wasn't. And it was a very clear watershed moment for me. Manager was totally oblivious to it. And so ultimately we parted ways. And that's what happens, isn't it? If you don't understand your people, understand what they care about, what motivates them, all of these things. It's a good lesson. I like it. Possibly leads us into the next question. It might be the same answer, but from the opposite direction. What do you think is the biggest mistake that a manager can make?
Yeah, I think that is the same answer. It's like,
yeah.
how about you? It's like,
There we go.
If you're like, you need to do this because it's going to make my life better. It's like, okay, that's great for you. What's in it for me? That being said, I often do give people advice to care about what their manager cares about because it will help their own career and help their own chances and more likely to get them promoted. Because if you make your manager look good, they argue for you, they use their authority in ways that help you. But as a manager, I really think, if you put it all about yourself, you're going to not be an effective leader because people will not follow you if they don't get something out of the deal.
Absolutely. But I think you're right to do that as well, because that's still leadership, isn't it? I think we talk about leadership and management sometimes they're the same thing, but it's very possible to lead upwards, as it were, particularly if your manager is perhaps one of those difficult people or perhaps not as adept at leadership as you are. Hasn't had the same training, shall we say. Yeah, that's a fair way of putting it, I think.
Yeah.
So I think, it's the same skill applied for the same reason, isn't it, really? Okay. If you could go back and do one thing differently in your career, what would that be? Even
though I knew this was coming, it's still a hard question because everything's chained together in so many ways. It's hard, it's like the butterfly effect. Like, I don't know, like if I change this one thing, how things would be different. But I think if I had to go back, the thing I probably would have done is quit physics sooner. I got stuck in physics because I had determined I was going to be a physicist like in middle school. Like I read the Richard Feynman's autobiography, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. And I'm like, that's what I want to be when I grow up. That sounds awesome. Turns out he could get away with goof around all the time because he was a freaking genius. And I was not, it turned out. And but I determined that's what I was going to do. I was going to go get the degree. I was going to go get a doctorate, going to go become a professor. And I stayed on that path at least 3 years and probably 6 years past what I should have realized. Like my freshman year at college, I was actually nearly failing my physics classes and I was acing my computer science classes without even trying. And my freshman advisor was like, so you're going to major in computer science, right? I'm like, no, I'm a physics major. He was like, are you sure about that? That seems like a bad decision. But I was like, no, this is what I'm going to do. And it's hard, but that's good. I'll figure it out. And I did figure it out and I went to grad school. But it turned out that I actually didn't love doing physics. It wasn't my passion. And it's really hard to get a PhD in something you don't want to spend all your time doing. And I figured that out within probably 2 months of getting to grad school. And I still stayed there 3 years because I don't know what else to do. And I played a lot of volleyball. Made a bunch of computer games, but in retrospect, that was kind of a wasted 3 years. If I just had the courage to go find a job, it could have changed my life. Could have moved on this track a little sooner.
I think a lot of people would. I mean, I know I would. A lot of people would probably have similar things, particularly in their academic careers.
It's funny because you described earlier, like, I think about things very methodically and step by step. And like, that's like a scientist training, like first principles. Let me put it out in terms of scientific method. Here's the experiments you run. Here's the data you gather. Like that all comes from the scientist training. So like, I can justify it in that sense and say I learned a lot from it. But, I think I could have figured it out in other ways if I'd had the chance.
Yeah, that's why I'm glad I don't have to answer this question, actually, because it is such a conundrum for me. Because on the one hand, like, of course, who wouldn't want the opportunity to go and change something? But then on the other hand, same as you, I look at all the mistakes and the missteps, and I'm far enough away from them now. I'm far enough removed in the timeline, I suppose, that I can look back at those and see what I learned from them rather than I wish I hadn't done that. And so if you go back and undo one of them, then you lose what you learned. Yeah, it's a tough one. Sorry.
Yeah. Learning to reframe mistakes and things going wrong as learning experiences is such a powerful, powerful mindset. And it really changes the approach to the world.
On a similar vein, maybe to that one then, what advice would you offer to new managers in the audience? Because that is our target audience after all, who are maybe struggling with their new responsibilities and not quite getting to grips with that new job.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say it's not about you again, but let me expand on that. I think the really difficult thing that it's rarely touched upon in manager training is that management is a different job. Sounds obvious, but it's different to be a manager than an individual contributor. So in school, you are rewarded for getting the right answer, solving the problem yourself, taking it and doing the hardest thing yourself. As an individual contributor, you're rewarded for doing the job yourself, taking on the hardest problems, solving it by yourself, not working with others necessarily. And then you become a manager, and that's not your job anymore. Your job is to give the work to the people on your team and organize and make them more productive. And that's a completely different mindset where it's like, it's so easy to say like, let me dive in and do that for you because I can do it better and faster and more accurately, which is all true. It feels weird for an engineer to say like, I'm going to give the work to somebody who's not going to do it as well. That doesn't seem like it can possibly be the right answer. And yet there's no way to scale because the way I frame it for a lot of my clients is saying like, look, right now the company has one of you. But if you can coach up the 5 people under you to do what you can do, they'll have 5 of you. And that's way better for the company. So yeah, they're not as good as you today. Your job is to get them to your level. And that's just a very different mindset. So I guess that would be my invitation to a new manager is let go of doing it yourself and change your perspective to how do I get my team to operate at the level I'm already at? Because that is a truly empowering and scalable experience. That's how you scale as a leader.
100%. Yeah, no, I love that. And it's yes, of course. Like you could probably do it faster, better, and do a better job than they would. But if you do it for them every time, that will always be true. So you're absolutely right. You've got to coach them up. It's the force multiplier, isn't it? I guess is you're creating more value for the business by coaching them up and by replicating yourself even to an extent. In terms of capability, not personality, I should add, because I think a lot of people try and clone themselves, and that can be quite unsettling.
Yeah, this reminds me of I listened to an interview once with a guy named Jerry Colonna, who's a famous executive coach. He's called the CEO Whisperer. And that's what he's asking about coaching. And he talked about the experience when somebody asked him what they should do. And he knows the answer. He knows what they should do. He's like, but if I give them the answer, I'm reinforcing a worldview where they can't figure it out themselves. And I refuse to do that to them. I'm there to empower them. And I heard that, it was like, oh, dagger to the heart. Because there's, as you can probably tell from this interview, I like knowing things. I like talking about things. I like having the answer. And it's really tempting for me to give the answer when I have it. And it doesn't serve my clients. It's far better for them to ask questions, guide them to get to their own answer, because then they realize they can do it themselves. And as a manager, part of your job is to be a coach in that sense. Help your people expand their sense of what they can do.
That's a very good quote. I do like it. I'm going to have to look up that interview now.
Yeah, I'll send it to you afterwards.
That'd be great. Please do, yeah.
Leadership Heroes.
Okay, so last question. My favorite question, probably because it's usually the most difficult one. Not because I'm a sadist. It's just because I like the question. So it's called Leadership Heroes. And the question is, if you had to pick one person, they could be alive or dead, past, present, real, fictional, up to you, who in your opinion would perfectly embody leadership, who would that person be and why?
Yeah, I was really glad you sent this question ahead of time because I spent like an hour thinking about it this morning. I'm like, there's so many leaders that I respect in different ways, and like, Lincoln with a team of rivals and bringing people together, and Genghis Khan for like just the way he was able to adapt to all sorts of different situations. But the one I landed on kind of depends on my definition of leadership I mentioned before, of like identifying something that needs to change and mobilizing people to do something about it. And so I came to actually with Martin Luther King Jr. because he did not have formal authority. He was a preacher. And at a very young age, like said, this needs to change and I'm going to do something about it. And I'm going to do what I can from where I stand. And he had a huge impact. I mean, I looked it up this morning, like he was assassinated before he was 40 years old. Like the amount of impact he had in the short working career that he had is huge. And he did it without any formal election. Nobody appointed him to do anything. He did it through the sheer force of his personality and his ability to get people inspired to say, I have a dream. I mean, that's literally his speech. I have a dream. And people followed him because of that dream. And that to me really embodies leadership. It's like, I'm going to paint such a compelling picture for you that you want to follow me. You are going to put people's lives on the line to follow you. Man, can you imagine a corporate leader that you're like, I will put my life on the line to follow you? It's really hard to imagine. And he could do that and inspire people in that way at such a young age. I think he's a fantastic leader.
I agree. I mean, not only is he also on my short list, but I think he would be on any reasonable person's short list, to be honest. I think one other aspect that people sometimes forget as well is he achieved all of that despite at times his own government working actively against him. So
absolutely.
It makes it all the more impressive, doesn't it? And yeah, I mean, such a great example of a leader.
Because what I like, the other thing I'll point out is because of that, he had all these obstacles, and it would have been very easy for him to say, like, well, there's nothing I can do. I don't have power. Nobody listens to me. And it would have been a very defeatist kind of mindset. And instead, of like, what can I do? I can speak. Let me speak. Let me use my words. And so he did. And people followed him. And I like that as an inspiration for people out there. They're like, I'm stuck in this environment that's working against me. The CEO is an idiot. And there's nothing I can do about it. It's like, let's test that assumption. What can you do? What can you do from here? What's the next action you can try that might move things in the direction you want? That's what I want to inspire people to do. That's what I try to do as an executive coach. And that's why I thought he would be a great example of a really good leader.
Yeah, I like it. It's a good one. And I mean, we've had it before, of course, because it is, such a well-known example of leadership. And I mean, he's famous the world over. So, but that doesn't diminish the fact that you've made an excellent choice. So there we go.
Well, I decided not to go. I could try to come up with something obscure, but like, let's stick to the message.
Yeah,
stick to the message.
Definitely. No, I think there's a lot to be said for that style of leadership as well, and the inspiration towards the common good and doing it in non-violent ways, and just the sheer number of people that he inspired, even like decades after his passing. I mean, it's difficult to think of a better example of a leader right now, to be honest. Then I didn't have time to prepare.
Thank you for giving me the time to think through that.
Of course. No, it's only fair when you're going to ask such a horribly difficult question. So, well, Eric, it's been lovely talking to you and hearing all these stories from you today. Thank you so much for your time. Last thing I will ask you is if any of the listeners have been inspired by what they've heard, and I'm sure many of them will have been, and would like to learn more, perhaps get a copy of your book or get in touch with you, would you like to point them towards a website or some other way they can do so?
Yeah, my coaching site is toomanytrees.com. That's kind of playing off the idea of can't see the forest for the trees. I help people see the big picture, get out of the trees and see what's going on. So toomanytrees.com. There's a link there to the book. And if you want to then follow me on LinkedIn, I'm happy. I publish a couple of things each week on LinkedIn about things I'm learning and thinking about. But I don't point people to LinkedIn first because nobody can spell my name. So start with Too Many Trees.
Fair enough. I will pop the links in the episode description as well anyway, so they won't have to spell your name. They can just click on the thing. Great. Well, thanks again so much for your time, and have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thanks so much, David. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Likewise. Thanks for being here. Well, listeners, by now, the reason for the episode title this week is pretty clear. Simple but not easy has certainly been a recurring theme of today's discussion. And as ever, it's crucial to stay informed and empowered to help you succeed as a leader when things are simple but challenging, and even when things are complex and extra difficult. So visit www.leadernotaboss.com for a page full of resources, links, and insights that will help equip you to lead with flexibility and confidence. Plus, don't miss the chance to schedule a complimentary consultation with me where we will discuss your specific leadership challenges and goals. Huge thank you to Eric today for sharing his expertise and his insights with us all. Eric, your contributions are immensely valuable, and we've all benefited from hearing about your experiences, so thank you so much. And to our listeners, your support is what keeps this podcast going. Your reviews and feedback are my personal inspiration, so thank you and keep them coming. And finally, I have some Leading with Integrity news for you. Next month, we'll be doing a themed series of episodes focused on the people-first aspects of leadership from a variety of different perspectives. I'm calling it The Heart of Leadership, a people-first journey, because you have to name these things, apparently. And we'll be kicking things off in that little mini-series in next week's episode, looking at leadership and interpersonal interactions from a customer service point of view, where I'll be joined by Pierre Bowsy, who has an immense amount of wisdom to share on that subject. So mark your calendars, stay tuned or subscribe if you like so you don't miss it. And I can't wait to welcome you again to another great conversation about leadership. Until then, take care and be a leader, not a boss.